mean, there's been some pretty big, like $1 million sweep of Echo Park in Los Angeles in March. And, these kinds of things are happening all over. That is just forcing to the surface this conversation about like, why are people unhoused? What does this have to do with city policy? How are wealthy developers supported and corporations in our cities and not the people who are actually the most in danger of not being housed? That, and why are we spending $1 million to have the police raid this encampment instead of spending that money on housing, which is the obvious need? I think all of this comes to the surface very intensely in mutual aid projects because people are just really up close with how the crisis is being produced in individual people's lives and how many other options there would be for like government response or for a different approach that doesn't keep concentrating wealth.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this too is, Sam briefly mentioned Sandy and just kind of, or whatever hurricane it might be, is because a lot of government responses to crises, are about essentially just, putting a stoppage in the leak in the short term and not addressing things kind of in a long-term way. Is a lot of your, emphasis on mutual aid about building long-term systems in communities that can kind of sustain themselves over time as opposed to just having, say, the federal government come in, and without any really existing infrastructure, attempt to do something that is largely impossible if you're approaching it from that way.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue, I'm so glad you brought up this, like hurricanes and thinking about disasters. I would argue that, those disasters are created by the government, right? Like the failure to fix the levees in New Orleans or the failure to make sure people's housing is shored up for the kind of weather they're facing, not to mention the fact that we still are contributing to climate change and the government will not reduce the things that would actually make climate change, that would curb climate change. We're still building it, right? So if we see these crises as produced by the government and then FEMA, when it shows up, when the federal government shows up to do emergency management, they show up late. Mostly the government response is things like policing people, shooting people on that bridge in New Orleans, the response tends to be more militarized and less about saving lives or making sure people can evacuate or whatever. And then like in Sandy, they gave people loans. They gave homeowners loans to fix their houses. They're not giving people what they need. And then they usually give almost nothing to like renters or itinerant people. And so that, as usual with poor relief and disaster relief, you see like any relief that comes more likely to go to white people, more likely to go to upper class people. I also think about the Camp Fire in California, Paradise, California in 2018. That fire was caused by PG&E, right? PG&E is this kind of like really big, utilities company that can't really maintain its structure well because it's really big and operating for profit, not to do a great job, right? Just how skinny can we make this, how big can we make the profit margin? And then because of that, they cause fires. The first thing that the state of California does is pass a law that says that nobody can sue them, right? Like the first thing California does is protect PG&E, not the people who are facing the fire. And then they come and, the cops evict people out of the Walmart parking lot who are still living there, who have nowhere to live. And people today in Chico and that whole area are still disproportionately homeless because of that fire. So the government doesn't do disaster relief. And if they do, it's usually to move money around in ways that benefit a few corporations and sometimes maybe wealthy homeowners. And so given all of that, I think it really shifts our idea to exactly what you're saying. Like, what would we as communities want to put in place that would allow us to actually begin to try to prevent disasters and prepare for them? And I'm really relying on a lot of Naomi Klein's work to talk about this, her work around disaster capitalism, because she's like, yeah, when a disaster comes, they just do things that benefit big corporations. And one of the things she talks about, and a lot of other people are talking about as well, what would it look like to do things like, if we had a much deeper level of community participation, which I think for a lot of people starts with being part of a mutual aid project, we might get to conversations like, wow, I'd really love it if our community didn't use PG&E for our electricity. Could we do something with solar? Could we do something with wind? Like, could we have a mini grid that's not part of this really dangerous grid that PG&E does? Or could we be networked with other communities in our area in a way where it's more governed by our people? Or how do we want to do healthcare? There's a program in Oakland that I think is really useful. It's in a Black community where they've identified that if people call 911 around health issues, health emergencies, the police always come with the ambulance, and it's really, really dangerous for Black communities. And there's a lot of times that Black people get hurt or murdered by the police when they show up instead of getting the health care they need. And so this program called the Oakland Power Projects is deeply training people in that Black community to do emergency health care that includes mental health response, acute care like gunshots and things like that, and chronic care like diabetes and those kinds of health issues. They're like, we're just going to create our own way of meeting this health need because the way the government is offering us is so dangerous for the health of our community. So I think that's the ultimate vision for me of mutual aid is like, how do we move from kind of being passive participants and just having to accept the very like inadequate and harmful responses that are, supposed to address our needs, and instead like, let's make the responses that we think would help. Like most of our cities and counties are not ready for the blackout, the earthquake, the storm, whatever's coming. Like they're not. And they're not making sure that low income people's housing is safe. And they're, thinking about what happened in Texas last winter with the cold. Like what would it look like if we decided as people in those communities to do deep emergency preparedness, assuming that the government isn't going to show up in a good way. They're probably going to show up in a way that's harmful or really uneven. And then we started to say, well, what would actually prepare us? And I think that given the conditions we're facing right now, the kinds of crises that are happening in all of our communities, from economic crisis to ecological crisis, we need to kind of be doing that. And I think COVID has brought a lot more people into that kind of activity.
I want to circle back to that for a moment in terms of like that role of government in a few. But when you look back in recent history, I mean, I guess as you were saying, about the breakfast and Black Panthers and that notion where it destigmatizes and reorients the understanding of why someone's in a position of needing to get a breakfast for their kids or for themselves. Are there major systemic failures over the past, 15, 20 years that you see that were missed opportunities where we didn't have mutual aid, which could have really, both from a material standpoint, but also in terms of a standpoint of a broader understanding that this is a systemic problem as opposed to like, oh, I made, whatever. I should have taken that job way back when, and I'd have breakfast now. I mean, is there any that stand out to you?
You're talking opportunities? Missed opportunities for mutual aid responses. What I would say about that is that most often mutual aid responses happen at a very local level because that's often where disaster happens. So COVID is, I think the reason the idea of mutual aid has gone mainstream this past year is because COVID is kind of one of these rare disasters that happened everywhere at once, not evenly, but still, right? It's like the whole world had to deal with this. So the whole world was doing mutual aid. So journalists were like, wow, let's talk about this thing everyone's doing. It's really interesting. Whereas at every sort of site, you will see mutual aid popping up with every fire and hurricane. And the amount and capacity and depth of mutual aid people are able to practice often relates to like how deeply they already had community ties. Have they been doing baseline mutual aid already before the big storm or fire? So that's part of, what I'm really talking about is how can we sustain mutual aid efforts so that when we respond, we don't, burn out, or that also like we need a lot of people doing mutual aid because there's a lot of people in crisis. And so how do we have mutual aid projects that are capable of responding at the kind of quantity of the need? And I think this has been visible during COVID. So if I think about missed opportunities, I guess I think that mutual aid is always there. If you look at any disaster, it's there. If you look at any point of crisis, including the ongoing kinds of crises, like living in the most imprisoned country in the world, there's just so much mutual aid towards prisoners, towards their families. There's mutual aid everywhere where there is crisis. But we do live in a society that has pushed us intensely towards isolation. And I think that's worsened in the last, especially with the age of the internet. More people live alone. More people don't have live connections to neighbors or in their communities. And people are suffering a lot because of that. So that makes it harder to do mutual aid if people don't know anybody and people are moving a lot for jobs, like people are disconnected in a certain way. And so then your only safety net becomes 911. That's kind of the result of that. And I think also, that level of trained passivity, like someone else should come and save us, that is really convenient to a system that doesn't want people super activated and asking questions with each other and saying things should be different. So I think that's like a pretty big historical arc. And I would say that comes after 1960s and 70s is a high point of mutual aid in, think about like all the feminist health clinics. I mean, there's so many, there was both bold, revolutionary action happening and just tons of community mutual aid, at all the flashpoints in the anti-war movement, the anti-racist movements, feminist movements, et cetera, gay rights, et cetera. But then I think you see a pretty big backlash in the 80s. You see the Reagan administration. You see this, you see a new narrative and a new set of really dire economic conditions that we're still living under from the kinds of economic policies that were put in place that cause people to be more isolated, to have to work longer for less money, to have a harder time engaging in community work because they're barely getting by. And I think that we've been living off that. And now we're at this new peak where people are like, oh my God, disasters are abounding. We have to have each other's backs. And the system looks less legitimate because it's not meeting people's basic needs in such an obvious, painful way, kind of no matter who's president. And so I think we're seeing a new sweep of both bold resistance and mutual aid to meet these crisis conditions.
Having lived through the 80s, the ethos was very individualistic. Greed is good was not presented really with that much irony at that time. I should say. So let's just turn just briefly to, because a big portion of your book is also a how-to manual. It is for people who are going to engage in mutual aid, and some of the major pitfalls. The leadership aspect of it. You harken back to the Black Panthers as to some problematic leadership issues that they had, or at least the hierarchies or the mechanism. Talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls that people should be aware of as they engage in mutual aid.
Yeah. I think that a major concern is that we live in a culture that's based in hierarchy and where people go to jobs and have to either be try to be the boss of someone or just kind of numb out and get bossed around. And just, can I get by? Can I just do what this person says I have to do? And so we don't get very good at practicing the skills of being in a participatory space where everyone's a volunteer and, you really want to have the wisdom of the group determine what we're going to do together. We don't just want to steamroll other people and be my way or the highway, because then they'll just leave and stop participating. So we need a really different way of being together than the things we've learned at spaces like schools, often families, and jobs. And so that's a really big piece. How do we understand leadership that produces mutuality and lots of participation from everybody versus leadership that produces my concentrated power or yours, and gets everybody else to kind of go along. And that, I think what I talk about is how regarding the Black Panthers and other groups in the 60s and 70s, that there was a really popular framework then of a certain kind of, really hierarchical way of organizing groups. And there's a lot of downfalls to that. One, it often leads to people to some degree or another abusing their power or just not having the best idea, but their idea is the way it has to be because we've put them in charge. So that can be really hard, and that can mean people leave when they disagree, and there can be really big splits. Also, there's a long history of law enforcement infiltration of our social movements that's still going on today. And it was very intensely targeted at the Black liberation movement in the 60s and 70s. And so if you have this very clear set of who's in charge, you can either take those people down through assassination or arrest, or you can infiltrate and get one of your people in there. And the FBI did that a lot in that period. And so our groups are much more resilient and responsive if lots of people know how everything works and are deciding things together. Because then if something happens to any one person, the group still goes on, and one person can't sell out or be bought off in some way to do something that's not aligned with the group, which is also a problem in terms of our nonprofit world, in which, the philanthropist will pick off a leader and be like, we're going to make you our darling. And then now you're going to get paid and you're going to come work at the county or the city level. And then that person is it becomes very hard and confusing for other people in the movement. Is that person still our leader, or they now belong to the kind of our opponents, So ultimately the idea of having groups in which a lot of people are participating in decision making, and you do that in really thoughtful ways, which I kind of lay out methods for in the book based on things that have worked for lots of groups, allows more people to participate meaningfully and become really highly skilled at doing this, because we're all going to be, the rest of our lives are going to be full of disasters. So we're going to need to be responsive to a lot of different conditions. So we might be in a group to get today together about supporting people in our local jail, and tomorrow we might be in a different formation that's about people struggling with homelessness, and we also might be responding to the earthquake that's coming in a few years. So we want as many people as possible, as skilled up as possible, to be in groups together, treat each other well, make decisions together, not try to be the boss of everything, and actually like move with group wisdom.